All right, good morning again. So, being that it's Mother's Day, I wanted to talk about women in our lives, not necessarily our mothers, but those people who represent spiritual motherhood for us. Earlier this year, just a couple months ago, I went with my wife Eleanor to a memorial service for a woman that she would call her spiritual mentor. Some of you know this woman. She's famous in United Methodist circles in these parts. Her name was Nina Reeves. And Nina was responsible for providing most of the programming for Camp Simatonga for most of her lifetime. She was employed by the North Alabama Annual Conference when she was just a young woman, and throughout some of the I think the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, she ran many of the camps that if you grew up as a United Methodist young person going to summer camp in this part of the country, you probably are familiar with Nina. And at that event, at her memorial service, which happened just days before she was to turn 101 years old, hundreds of people came. Hundreds of people, because even though she had never had any children of her own, all of these people called herself Nina's spiritual children, many of whom are very much leaders in the faith and in the church today. Many people who went on to seminary and became pastors, men and women alike, people who are continuing to lead those summer camps now, and she is a beloved, towering giant of a figure for so many people. And it's curious, of course, that she never had any biological children, and that did not stop her from having that kind of influence on so many other people throughout the years. My wife and my mother-in-law both being students under her mentorship growing up. So just a really important part of our family's story. This also, coincidentally, this month marks the 70th anniversary, 7-0, of the ordination of women in the United Methodist Church, which 70 is a big number, and yet when you think about that there were women that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism in the 1700s, charged with leading small group ministries and taking an active role in the church, it took us a long time to start ordaining women. And though, yes, pat ourselves in the back, we were ahead of the curve in terms of a lot of American Christian traditions, it still is significant, and I owe a huge debt of gratitude not only to the women in my life like my mom and my grandmother, but also to Pastor Ruth, who was the pastor that led me through my confirmation experience and was there when I experienced my call to ministry, and all of the women who were a part of my Sunday school upbringing. I think about Cynthia and Sarah and Lori and Carol and all of these women that I remember to this day. I can pick out their faces, who taught my Sunday school classes as a kid. And honestly, truth be told, it was the women, not the men, who were the ones that were the real spiritual guideposts for me throughout most of my life. And I am deeply grateful for them. So I want you to think about those women in your life. And in all likelihood, there was a woman or women who are as much a part of your spiritual upbringing, who have been spiritual mothers, spiritual giant figures for you, as there have been men. And I want you to call to mind those people today as I spend the majority of my time talking to you about a story that I learned about from a couple of years ago that I think, as shocking as it is, has gone largely under the radar. And I want to think about the reasons why it might have gone under the radar, too. This story is really not my story, but it's a story that I read about, and I read about in the form of another sermon by a woman named Diana Butler Bass, and I've quoted her before. She's a fantastic preacher and a Christian writer. Some of you may be familiar with her. She comes out of the Episcopalian tradition. And so I am going to just say this right out of the gate. I am not a plagiarizer, at least not intentionally. Today is the exception. This is Diana Butler Bass's message, and I am borrowing liberally from what she said because I think it is worth sharing with you. All right, so she tells the story about a young woman named Libby Schrader. And Libby Schrader is a New Yorker, and she has grown up in the Christian faith. She's an Episcopalian, and she spends a lot of time as a singer-songwriter, writing Christian songs. And so she was one day in a garden in a church in New York City, and she was praying, and she felt that God or the Holy Spirit whispered to her, "Seek Mary Magdalene." Very specific, right? Except it doesn't really tell you what to do about that. So seek Mary Magdalene. And so she says that she did what she thought she should do, which is she called the local Episcopalian seminary in New York City, and she called them up and said, "Hey, who do I talk to?" And they said, "Well, why don't you come get a master's degree?" Which is, I think, what happens when you call the admissions office at a grad school. And so she signed up, and she said, "That sounds great. I'm going to study New Testament." And she pursued the program for a few years, and it was time to write her master's thesis. And Libby asked her advisor, "May I write on Mary Magdalene?" And she said, "I'm particularly interested in Mary Magdalene in the Gospel according to John, and I'd like to look at the 11th chapter." And so her advisor said, "By all means, do it." And she said, "You're in luck too, because the oldest intact manuscript we have of John's Gospel that dates back to the 4th century and was discovered in Egypt has now been digitized, and you, from your own laptop computer, can look at that manuscript, and you don't need to travel abroad." I think it's in Switzerland. You don't need to travel to Switzerland to see it. And it's called Papyrus 66. That's the name of the document that includes John chapters 1 through 14. And so Libby pulls up this, and she is now a student who has learned Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, and she is reading through it, and something curious catches her attention. She starts in John chapter 11, verse 1. Jay, I think we have a slide of this. It says, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha." Not a great sentence, but sometimes the translation into Greek and then to English, it gets a little jumbly. But this is our NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. That's what I read from each week in worship. That's what's on our Bible cart back here and in the pew or in the seat cushions. That we have the NRSV. So, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha." But when Libby looked at this ancient papyrus, she saw this. "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Mary." I put the red highlights in there so you can see the difference. And what she said was, "That's not what's in my Bible." And so she went back to the Bible and reread it again. And she notices the discrepancy. It's pretty plain, right? The city of the Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha, but now it says Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Mary. What kind of weird sentence is that? And then it continued to go on. And she noticed that there was ink that was added to this ancient papyrus scroll, and that the ink had taken the I in Maria, or Mary, and it had changed it in Greek to a theta, a TH sound, and the name Martha was added. The oldest, so tracking with me here, the oldest manuscript we have of John's Gospel ever found intact doesn't have the name Martha originally in it. And every time in John's Gospel, in Papyrus 66, that it says Martha, it is obvious that it is a right-over, it is an addition to make all of those Marys become Marthas. What's up with that? All of the time that it says sisters, the S is added. All of the time that it says his, it becomes a hers when it makes an exchange between Mary and Martha. So what's going on here? Well, there is a Mary and Martha that get discussed in Luke's gospel, in Luke 11, I believe. And you remember that story that Jesus goes to visit the home of Mary and Martha, and Mary sits at Jesus' feet and listens to him while Martha's busy in the kitchen and then fusses at her sister for not helping. You remember that story? So perhaps it's a desire to reconcile those two stories from one gospel account to the next. Oh, maybe, what about Martha? We should include Martha, right? But it gets more and more bizarre as the story goes on, because as Libby is looking at this text and is trying to make sense of it, she believes that she has stumbled across something that others have just managed to somehow overlook. And so she writes up her dissertation about this, and guess what? It gets some attention. Some excited people, some people that are really troubled by this, because what do you mean Martha doesn't exist in John's gospel, right? What does that mean? Play this out. Where does this go from here? Well, the Harvard Theological Review wrote a story on it, and they said, yeah, we think that she's making a pretty compelling case. And then I understand that it went over to Germany, which is where a group of stodgy old men who are kind of the gatekeepers of the Greek New Testament, and they decide what is real and what is not real. Well, they look at it and they said, gal, this young woman writing her master's thesis, she's making a pretty strong point here. And the implications are big, right? For one, it means that every time that from here on out, potentially when you buy a new study Bible or a Bible commentary, it might be that there's now an asterisk that says, well, and this is now in question about Martha and whether she was added as a character or not. So it makes some difference in biblical scholarship world, and for the Bible nerds that like me that want to dig into that, that's an interesting sort of caveat. But I think the more significant thing here is this. Let's say, best case scenario, most benign scenario, is that somebody was trying to say, hey, Martha's missing in John. Maybe we should just add her in so that it's in keeping with Luke's gospel. But if it's something a little uglier than that, maybe it's meant to suppress Mary's voice. Because here's the interesting thing that ends up happening. If we read a little bit further on in John's gospel, in the same chapter 11, we get to this section. Jay, can we put that next slide up? We get to John 11:21. Martha, now remember Martha's in question here, so let's just read it as Mary or Martha, said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died, but even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to him, your brother will rise again. Martha Mary said to him, I know that he will rise again on the resurrection on the last day. Next slide. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. This last line, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. Sear this into your memory right now, because the significance of this cannot be understated. Peter, in the Synoptic Gospels, gets the credit at Caesarea Philippi when Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Messiah. And it's the first confession of Jesus' messiahship in the Bible. And Peter gets the credit for that. And Jesus turns to Peter, says, yes, Simon, Peter, which means rock, on this rock I will build my church. Peter's faithfulness in acknowledging Jesus' messiahship is acknowledged and recognized, and Jesus says, and because of your faithfulness, on you, Peter the rock, will my church be built. It's called this messianic recognition, right? It's this powerful moment where it is Peter who recognizes this. But the next person The next person to recognize Jesus' messiahship, according to this, is Martha. Martha's statement, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah." Now, after this, Martha disappears from John's gospel. But if in fact it's Mary, Mary Magdalene, Mary Lazarus' sister, now we have a much more significant figure. Because that Mary, a chapter later, will go and wash Jesus' feet with the perfume of her hair. That Mary will be the first person to witness Jesus after the resurrection has taken place at the empty tomb. That Mary will recognize Jesus' lordship in the resurrection as well. Now, all of a sudden, that Mary plays a much bigger part than the huge part that she already plays. And could it be that somebody was uncomfortable very early on in the 4th or 5th century with a woman reaching to that elevation of significance, that kind of worthiness and level and esteem that Peter was, and decided that it'd be better off to make that Martha's role, and then Martha sort of fades into history. But to make for an even more compelling argument, Mary Magdalene is sometimes, we are told that Mary gets that name because she is from the village of Magdala. And Magdala, for those of you who have been to the Holy Land, is still the remains of an ancient town that is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The problem is, Magdala didn't exist at the time of Jesus. It came into being a couple hundred years after Jesus' time. Furthermore, John says that Mary and Lazarus live in a town called Bethany, not Magdala. What's interesting is that in Aramaic, the language that Jesus and Mary would have spoken, Magdala means tower or fortress. How fitting, then, that the first person to confess Jesus' lordship and messiahship is given the name Rock, and the second one to do it is called Tower or Fortress. Mary's name is not where she's from. Mary's name is her title. Jesus calls her Mary the Rock, or Mary the Tower, and Peter, Cephas, the Rock. What beautiful imagery for this tandem that leads the church forward, that carries on the good news, the first witnesses of Jesus at the resurrection, the ones who will be the message bearers, the ones who carry the hope and the good news forward, the ones who we stand on and lean on as rock and tower for the faith tradition that we celebrate today. I thought it was fitting that I share this story on Mother's Day. A day where we set aside a time to say thanks to Mom, to send a card, to maybe do things special, but for those women who are the spiritual mothers to us, like so many women before them, oftentimes are in the background, doing the jobs that are often overlooked, the thankless things, and yet they are the ones, that steady presence, that towering figure in our lives, who has led us, guided us, mentored us, and carried us forward to this place that we are today. And so on this Mother's Day, we give thanks for the women, unsung, sometimes even blotted out by history. But we lift up them and their memories and their contribution today, and give thanks for shaping us and making us who we are. Because today we give thanks for and sing praises for those folks who have been the towers and the rocks upon which we stand. Let us pray.